When Madeline Newman signed up for Wild Hearts, Detroit's newest reality show about environmental conservation, she thought the biggest risk would be sleeping in a tent for 3 weeks. She certainly did not expect to lock eyes with Blake Jennings across a misty morning clearing and feel her entire world shift on its axis like a camera finding its perfect focus. But there she was, crouched behind a fallen log with her vintage Nikon, capturing the ethereal dance of fog through ancient oak trees when she heard the distinctive click of another camera shutter nearby. "Great minds think alike," came a warm, slightly amused voice from behind a cluster of maple saplings. Madeline looked up to find a man emerging from the morning mist like something out of a fairy tale. Expensive camera equipment slung across his broad shoulders, dark hair tousled by the early breeze. He wore the kind of hiking boots that cost more than her monthly grocery budget, but his smile was unpretentious and genuinely curious. "Are you another contestant?" she asked, lowering her camera but keeping her finger poised on the shutter release. Something about this stranger made her photographer's instincts hum with anticipation. Blake Jennings had spent the last 5 years building his automotive empire, Jennings Luxury Motors, into Detroit's most exclusive dealership. At 36, he had everything money could buy. A penthouse overlooking the Detroit River, a garage full of vintage Ferraris, and enough influence to make or break careers. What he did not have was someone who looked at him the way this woman was looking at him now, like he was just another person worth getting to know, rather than a walking investment opportunity. "Something like that," he said, technically telling the truth. As one of the show's primary investors and executive producers, he was definitely involved in the project. He just happened to be taking a morning walk through Belle Isle Park where they were filming, when he spotted her crouched in perfect photographer's stance. "I am Blake." "Madeline," she replied, standing and brushing dirt from her worn jeans. "And judging by that camera setup, you are either really serious about photography or really good at pretending to be." Blake found himself genuinely laughing for the first time in months. "A little of both, actually. What about you? That vintage Nikon suggests you know what you are doing." "I teach biology at Detroit Public School District," Madeline said, unconsciously straightening her shoulders with pride. "But photography is my real passion. I am hoping this show will give me material for a book I want to write about urban wildlife conservation." There it was, the moment Blake realized this woman was nothing like the socialites and business associates who usually orbited his world. Madeline Newman talked about her dreams with the kind of authentic enthusiasm that had been surgically removed from most people in his social circle. She cared about things that mattered, and she did not seem to care at all about his net worth or social status. "A book sounds incredible," he said, meaning it. "What kind of wildlife thrives in Detroit?" For the next 20 minutes, Madeline forgot entirely that she was supposed to be competing in a reality show. She found herself explaining the surprising biodiversity of Belle Isle, how peregrine falcons nested on the Ambassador Bridge, how the Detroit River served as a crucial migration corridor. Blake listened with the kind of focused attention that made her feel like the most interesting person in the world. "The producers want us to focus on dramatic interpersonal conflicts," she confided. "But honestly, I am more excited about documenting how nature reclaims urban spaces. Detroit has this incredible story of resilience that nobody talks about." Blake felt an unfamiliar tightness in his chest. Here was a woman who saw beauty where others saw decay, who found hope in abandoned lots turned into community gardens, who genuinely believed in making the world better rather than just making money. She was everything his controlled, calculated world was not. "I have a feeling you're going to shake things up around here," he said softly. What neither of them knew was that Blake's sister Sophia was watching from behind the production tent, her manicured fingers already flying across her phone screen as she texted their mother Isabella about this concerning development. A school teacher, of all things. How perfectly disastrous. Meanwhile, Uncle Marcus Jennings stood in the show's temporary headquarters, studying monitor feeds with the calculating expression of a man who had spent decades eliminating threats to his carefully constructed plans. Blake was supposed to be focused on expanding the business internationally, not getting distracted by some idealistic teacher with dirt under her fingernails. As Madeline and Blake finally parted ways, she to join the other contestants for their first group challenge, he to attend a production meeting he was already 20 minutes late for, neither could shake the feeling that something fundamental had just changed. "Ready to save the world, Maddie?" called out her best friend Rachel Kim from across the clearing, her designer hiking outfit somehow managing to look both practical and Instagram-ready. "Something like that," Madeline replied, unconsciously echoing Blake's earlier words as she watched him disappear into the tree line. But instead of saving the world, she was beginning to suspect this reality show might end up changing her own world entirely. The morning sun climbed higher through the canopy, casting long shadows across Belle Isle as 24 contestants prepared for 3 weeks of challenges that would test their environmental knowledge, survival skills, and ability to work as a team. What none of them realized was that the real drama was only just beginning, and it had nothing to do with winning $100,000. It had everything to do with a biology teacher who saw wonder in the everyday world, and a businessman who was about to discover that all his carefully constructed walls were no match for someone who genuinely cared about things money could not buy. The game, as they say, was about to change completely. 3 days into filming, Madeline had already established herself as the contestant everyone either loved or found insufferably earnest, depending on their own relationship with sincerity. She had helped struggling teammates with shelter construction, identified 17 different bird species during their morning nature walk, and somehow made friends with the most antisocial person in camp, a gruff survival expert named Pete, who usually communicated exclusively in grunts. "Newman's got this Disney princess thing going on," complained Tiffany Walsh, a social media influencer from Los Angeles who had joined the show to promote her wellness brand. "Like, we get it. You love trees. Some of us are here to actually win." Rachel Kim rolled her eyes as she applied sunscreen with the precision of someone who had never met a skincare routine she could not optimize. "Maybe if you spent less time complaining and more time learning the difference between poison ivy and Virginia creeper, you would not have needed Maddie to save you from that rash yesterday." Meanwhile, Blake was discovering that being an executive producer did not make him immune to the show's most dangerous element: genuine human connection. He found himself inventing reasons to visit the Belle Isle location, ostensibly to check on production details, but actually hoping to catch glimpses of Madeline in her natural habitat. "Sir, the Detroit location scouting report is ready for your review," announced James Wright, his assistant, holding out a tablet during what was supposed to be a brief site visit. Blake barely glanced at the screen. Across the clearing, Madeline was teaching a group of contestants how to identify animal tracks in the mud near the shoreline, her entire face lighting up as she explained the difference between raccoon and opossum prints. She had tied her hair back with what appeared to be a piece of vine, and there was dirt smudged across her cheek that she seemed completely unaware of. "Blake?" James prompted, following his boss's gaze with growing concern. "The location report?" "Right, yes," Blake said, reluctantly focusing on business. "Looks comprehensive." "Good work." What Blake did not notice was his Uncle Marcus approaching from behind, taking in the scene with the sharp-eyed assessment of a predator identifying weakness in prey. "Nephew," Marcus said smoothly, "I trust everything is proceeding according to schedule." "Of course," Blake replied, instinctively straightening into his business persona. "The contestants are adapting well to the challenges, and early footage looks promising." Marcus nodded, but his eyes remained fixed on Madeline, who was now crouched beside the water's edge, completely absorbed in photographing what appeared to be a small turtle. "That one seems particularly enthusiastic about the experience." There was something in his uncle's tone that made Blake's jaw tighten imperceptibly. Madeline brings authentic expertise to the show. Viewers respond well to genuine passion. Indeed, Marcus mused, though I hope her passion does not become a distraction from the business objectives. We have significant investments riding on this project's success. Before Blake could respond, director Eddie Martinez approached with the harried expression of someone trying to manage both artistic vision and commercial reality. Blake, thank God you are here. We need to discuss the elimination challenge for next week. The network wants more interpersonal drama, but half our contestants are more interested in building the perfect composting system than creating television-worthy conflict. Maybe that says something about what audiences actually want to see, Blake suggested, his eyes drifting back toward Madeline, who was now showing other contestants how to test water quality using a portable kit she had apparently brought from her classroom. Eddie followed his gaze and sighed. Look, I love the educational content, I really do, but Newman is almost too good for reality television. She makes everyone else look petty and shallow by comparison, which creates a narrative problem. Viewers need someone to root against. So, manufacture conflict, Marcus interjected smoothly. Edit conversations out of context, create romantic triangles, play up personality clashes. It is standard practice. Blake felt something cold settle in his stomach. We agreed on authentic storytelling when I signed on to this project. Authentic storytelling that generates ratings, Marcus corrected. Otherwise, what is the point? As if summoned by their conversation, Madeline chose that moment to approach their small group, her vintage camera hanging around her neck and her expression bright with curiosity. Excuse me, she said politely. I was wondering if it would be possible to get permission to take some behind-the-scenes photographs. Nothing that would compromise the show's production, just documentation of how the crew works to minimize environmental impact during filming. I think it would make a great addition to my book project. Eddie and Marcus exchanged glances that Blake did not like at all. That is an interesting idea, Eddie said carefully, but we would need to review any photographs before they could be used publicly. Legal concerns, you understand. Of course, Madeline agreed readily. I am happy to sign whatever agreements are necessary. I just think it is important to show how entertainment can be produced responsibly. After she walked away, Marcus turned to Blake with an expression that was part amusement, part calculation. She really is quite idealistic, is she not? She has principles, Blake replied evenly. Some people find that refreshing. Some people, Marcus agreed, also find it commercially inconvenient. That evening, as Blake sat in his penthouse reviewing production dailies, he found himself pausing on footage of Madeline explaining water conservation techniques to her teammates. She spoke with her hands, gesturing enthusiastically as she described rain collection systems and natural filtration methods. The camera loved her. There was something magnetic about her genuine enthusiasm that made even mundane topics seem fascinating. His phone buzzed with a text from his sister Sophia. Mother wants to know when you are bringing someone appropriate to Sunday dinner. Please tell me you are not developing feelings for that teacher from the show. Blake stared at the message for a long moment before deleting it without responding. Through his floor-to-ceiling windows, Detroit's skyline glittered with the artificial brilliance of commerce and industry, but somehow all he could think about was morning mist in Belle Isle Park and the way Madeline Newman looked at the world like it was full of wonders still waiting to be discovered. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new conflicts, and new opportunities for both connection and manipulation. The game was becoming more complicated by the day, and Blake was beginning to realize that the stakes were much higher than anyone had originally imagined. Week 2 of filming brought unseasonably warm weather to Belle Isle Park, which meant the contestants were dealing with everything from aggressive mosquitoes to unexpected thunderstorms that turned their carefully planned challenges into exercises in creative problem-solving. It also meant that Blake's excuses for visiting the set were becoming increasingly transparent, at least to anyone paying attention. You have been to location 7 times this week. James observed during their drive back to downtown Detroit after another essential production meeting. The directors seem perfectly capable of managing daily operations without executive oversight. Blake adjusted his collar, suddenly feeling like the air conditioning in his Tesla was inadequate. Hands-on management ensures quality control. This show represents a significant investment in Jennings Industries' reputation. Of course, sir, James replied, in the carefully neutral tone of someone who had worked for the Jennings family long enough to recognize self-deception when he heard it. The truth was that Blake had never been more invested in any project, professional or personal. Watching Madeline navigate the social dynamics of reality television was like observing a masterclass in authenticity. She somehow managed to be competitive without being ruthless, helpful without being patronizing, and consistently genuine in an environment designed to bring out people's worst impulses. "Did you see how she handled the shelter challenge yesterday?" he found himself asking. "Miss Newman, sir. Her team's tarp got damaged in the storm, but instead of complaining or trying to sabotage other teams, she collaborated with them to design a communal shelter system that actually worked better than what anyone had built individually. The other contestants were so impressed, they voted her team leader for next week." James glanced at his boss in the rearview mirror. That does sound like effective leadership. What James did not mention was the conversation he had overheard between Marcus Jennings and director Eddie Martinez earlier that afternoon. Something about managing the Newman situation and protecting the show's commercial interests. As Blake's assistant, James had learned to file away information that might become relevant later, even when he hoped it would not. Back at Belle Isle, Madeline was experiencing her own complications. The show's format required contestants to vote each other off periodically, and she was struggling with the strategic implications of elimination challenges that pitted her genuine friendships against her desire to continue documenting Detroit's urban wildlife. "You are thinking too hard about this," Rachel said, as they sat by the Detroit River, watching the sun set over the Windsor skyline. "It is a game, Maddie. Everyone knows that going in. But these people have become my friends," Madeline protested, gesturing toward their fellow contestants scattered around the campsite. "How do I vote to eliminate someone whose dreams matter as much as mine?" Rachel studied her best friend with the fond exasperation of someone who had spent years trying to convince an optimist that the world was more complicated than she wanted it to be. "You remember that this is television, not real life. The relationships you build here are temporary. The money you could win is real." "Is it, though?" Madeline asked, absently photographing a blue heron that had landed near the water's edge. "Temporary, I mean. Some connections feel different." She was thinking about Blake, though she had not admitted that to anyone, including herself. Their morning photography sessions had become an unofficial routine. He would appear in the early mist like some kind of perfectly dressed woodland spirit, and they would spend an hour capturing the park's wildlife in the golden light before the production crew arrived. They talked about everything from camera techniques to conservation philosophy, and Madeline found herself looking forward to these conversations more than any of the official challenges. "Speaking of connections," Rachel said with the tone of someone about to deliver uncomfortable truth, "I need to tell you something about your mysterious photographer friend." Madeline lowered her camera. "What about Blake?" "I did some research. Blake Jennings is not just some guy who likes taking pictures of birds, Maddie. He owns Jennings Luxury Motors, one of the biggest automotive dealerships in the Midwest. He is also listed as an executive producer of this show." The words hit Madeline like a physical blow. "Executive producer? As in, he partially owns the show you are competing in? As in, he has influence over who wins and who goes home?" Rachel's voice was gentle but firm. "I'm not saying he has ulterior motives, but you need to know what you are dealing with." Madeline sat quietly for several minutes, processing this information while watching the heron fish in the shallow water. Everything about her morning conversations with Blake suddenly took on different implications. Had he been evaluating her performance, gathering information for production decisions? Or worse, Had their apparent connection been some kind of elaborate manipulation? Why would not he tell me? She asked finally. Maybe because he knew it would change how you saw him, Rachel suggested. Rich guys are not exactly used to people liking them for their sparkling personalities. That evening, as contestants gathered around the campfire for their weekly elimination ceremony, Madeline found herself studying Blake's face in the flickering light. He stood behind the cameras with the other producers, professionally distant from the proceedings, but clearly focused on every word, every gesture, every strategic alliance being formed and broken. When her name was called as one of the contestants safe from elimination, she felt a complex mix of relief and suspicion. Had she earned her place through her contributions to the challenges, or had Blake influenced the decision somehow? After the ceremony, as most contestants headed to their tents, Madeline lingered by the dying fire, ostensibly reviewing her photographs from the day, but actually trying to process her conflicted feelings about discovery and betrayal and the possibility that nothing she had experienced was entirely genuine. Trouble sleeping? Blake's voice came from the edge of the clearing, soft enough not to wake anyone but clear enough to find her in the darkness. Madeline looked up, her camera still in her hands like a shield between them. Just thinking. Blake approached slowly, as if sensing her changed mood. Mind if I join you? I promise not to lecture you about f-stops or shutter speeds. Under different circumstances, his gentle humor would have made her smile. Tonight, it felt like evidence of manipulation. I know who you are, Blake. He stopped walking. What do you mean? I know you are not just some photography enthusiast who happens to be wandering around Belle Isle at dawn every morning. I know about Jennings Luxury Motors. I know you are an executive producer of this show. Her voice stayed level, but he could hear the hurt underneath the words. Blake felt the bottom drop out of his carefully constructed world. Madeline, I can explain. Can you? She interrupted, standing and slinging her camera bag over her shoulder. Because from where I sit, it looks like you have been lying to me from the moment we met, and I have to wonder what else about this whole experience has been manufactured for entertainment value. She walked away before he could respond, leaving Blake alone by the dying fire, with the uncomfortable realization that his worst fears about mixing business with personal feelings were coming true in ways he had never anticipated. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new complications, and the growing certainty that some lines once crossed could never be uncrossed again. The morning after Madeline's confrontation with Blake, Belle Isle Park felt different, charged with the kind of tension that makes wildlife skittish and humans unpredictable. She had spent most of the night staring at her tent ceiling, alternating between anger at being deceived and disappointment that her first genuine connection in months had been built on lies of omission. Blake, meanwhile, had paced his penthouse until 3 a.m, drafting and deleting text messages that ranged from desperate apologies to detailed explanations to formal requests for private conversations. Nothing felt adequate to bridge the gap that his deception had created. You look terrible, Rachel observed as Madeline emerged from her tent with the hollow-eyed determination of someone running on principle instead of sleep. Thank you for that honest assessment, Madeline muttered, checking her camera equipment with more aggression than the delicate instruments deserved. I take it you talked to him? I told him I knew who he was. He tried to explain. I left. Madeline paused in her equipment check. What kind of person builds a relationship on lies? Even if they are lies of omission. Rachel, who had spent years navigating the complicated waters of Detroit's fashion industry, recognized the particular variety of hurt that comes from discovering someone you trust has been managing your perception of reality. Maybe the kind of person who is tired of being seen as a bank account instead of a human being. Do not defend him, Madeline said sharply. You were the one who warned me about his motives in the first place. I warned you to be careful, Rachel corrected. There is a difference between being careful and assuming the worst about someone's intentions. Their conversation was interrupted by the arrival of Eddie Martinez, who looked like he had been surviving on coffee and anxiety for the past week. Ladies, I hate to interrupt, but we need to discuss today's challenge. Corporate wants to up the drama quotient, which means we are introducing some new elements to keep viewers engaged. Madeline felt a familiar twist of unease in her stomach. What kind of new elements? Nothing too dramatic, Eddie assured her, though his expression suggested otherwise. We are bringing in some surprise guests, stirring up team dynamics, maybe introducing some external pressures to test how contestants handle stress. What Eddie did not mention was that Marcus Jennings had spent the previous evening making strategic phone calls to ensure those external pressures would be specifically designed to undermine Madeline's position in the competition. A few carefully placed rumors about preferential treatment, some edited footage that made her seem less genuine than she appeared in real time, and sudden rule changes that favored contestants with different skill sets. By noon, the effects of these machinations were becoming visible. Tiffany Walsh, the influencer who had spent 2 weeks complaining about Madeline's Disney princess energy, was suddenly asking pointed questions about fairness and transparency. "I am just saying," Tiffany announced during lunch break, her voice pitched to carry across the entire campsite. "Some people seem to have information the rest of us do not, like they know which challenges are coming next or which elimination ceremonies are just for show." Several contestants looked uncomfortable with the implication, but Pete, the gruff survival expert who had become Madeline's unlikely ally, snorted dismissively. "Newman's been sharing everything she knows since day one. If she had inside information, you would know about it too, because she cannot keep her mouth shut when she gets excited about something." "Maybe that is exactly what she wants us to think," suggested Derek, a personal trainer from Chicago who had been growing increasingly competitive as the elimination rounds narrowed their group. Madeline felt the familiar sensation of being studied like a specimen under a microscope, except this time the examination felt malicious rather than curious. "I do not have any inside information," she said quietly. "I am playing the same game as everyone else." "Are you, though?" Tiffany pressed. "Because I heard some interesting things about your morning photography sessions with certain members of the production team." The words hung in the air like a challenge, and Madeline realized with growing horror that her private conversations with Blake were somehow becoming public ammunition against her integrity. She looked around the circle of faces, seeing suspicion where there had been friendship, calculation where there had been camaraderie. "What exactly are you suggesting?" Rachel asked, her voice carrying the kind of sharp edge that made grown men reconsider their life choices. "I am not suggesting anything," Tiffany replied with false innocence. "I am just saying that appearances matter, and some appearances create questions about fairness." From behind the cameras, Blake watched this character assassination unfold with growing fury. He recognized his uncle's fingerprints all over the situation. The timing was too convenient, the accusations too specifically designed to isolate Madeline from her allies and create doubt about her authenticity. "We need to shut this down," he told Eddie quietly. "This is character assassination, not entertainment." Eddie glanced nervously toward Marcus, who was standing close enough to hear their conversation. "The network wants interpersonal conflict. This is what interpersonal conflict looks like. This is what manipulation looks like," Blake corrected, his voice carrying enough steel to make both men straighten unconsciously. "And it stops now." But Marcus stepped forward with the smooth confidence of someone who had been orchestrating corporate coups since before Blake was born. "Nephew, I understand your concern for fair play, but we cannot protect contestants from the natural consequences of their choices. If Miss Newman chose to form inappropriate relationships with production staff, that reflects on her judgment." "The only inappropriate thing here," Blake said evenly, "is using someone's personal connections as weapons against them." The confrontation might have escalated further, but Madeline chose that moment to stand up from the lunch circle and walk directly toward their small group. Her expression was composed, but Blake could see the hurt and determination in her eyes. "I would like to speak with you," she said to Blake, her voice carrying across the sudden silence that had fallen over the campsite. Privately. Blake nodded, following her toward a cluster of trees that would provide some privacy from both contestants and cameras. Behind them, he could hear the murmur of speculation beginning, but for the moment, he did not care about anything except the chance to explain himself to the woman who had somehow become the most important person in his carefully constructed world. "I know how this looks," he began as soon as they were out of earshot. "Do you?" Madeline interrupted. "Because from where I stand, it looks like I have been playing a game where the rules keep changing, and some players have access to information others do not. It looks like my genuine feelings have been turned into strategic ammunition against me, and it looks like the person I thought I was getting to know has been managing my perception of reality from the beginning." Blake felt each word like a physical blow, partly because they were fair accusations, and partly because they revealed how completely he had failed to protect her from the ugliest aspects of his world. "You are right," he said simply, "about all of it. I should have told you who I was from the beginning. I should have anticipated that our connection would be used against you. I should have protected you better." Madeline studied his face, looking for signs of manipulation or calculation, but finding only genuine regret and something that looked like vulnerability. "Why did not you tell me?" "Because," Blake said, his voice quieter now, "for the first time in years, someone was looking at me like I was just a person instead of a business opportunity. And I was selfish enough to want to hold on to that feeling for as long as possible." The honesty in his admission caught her off guard. She had prepared for excuses, justifications, or corporate doublespeak. She had not prepared for raw vulnerability from someone who seemed to have everything figured out. "The game is rigged," she said finally. "Is not it? This whole show, all the challenges, the eliminations, it is all theater designed to create specific outcomes." Blake hesitated, knowing that his answer would either rebuild or permanently destroy any chance they had for genuine connection. "Some of it is. More than I realized when I agreed to invest in the project. But your responses to the challenges, your relationships with other contestants, your passion for the subject matter, none of that is manufactured. That is all you." "How am I supposed to know what is real anymore?" It was the question Blake had been dreading because it forced him to confront the uncomfortable truth that his world was built on layers of artificial construction, and anyone who entered it would struggle to distinguish between authentic experience and elaborate performance. "I do not know," he admitted, "but I know that what I feel when I talk with you is real. I know that watching you teach other people about wildlife conservation has been the best part of my week for the past 2 weeks. And I know that I would rather lose every business investment I have ever made than lose the chance to know who you really are." Madeline stood quietly for several minutes, listening to the distant sounds of camp life and the closer sounds of Blake's uncertain breathing. Everything logical told her to walk away from this complication, to focus on the competition and her book project and the simple goal of winning enough money to fund her conservation work. But her heart was telling her something entirely different, and for the first time in her adult life, she was not sure which voice she should trust. The elimination ceremony that evening felt like a trial where the verdict had been decided before the evidence was presented. Madeline sat in the semicircle of remaining contestants, acutely aware that every gesture, every expression, every word was being evaluated not just by the judges, but by her fellow competitors who had been poisoned against her by carefully orchestrated rumors. "Tonight's challenge tested your ability to work as a team while maintaining individual excellence," announced the host, a former survival expert named Tom Bradley, whose television smile never quite reached his eyes. "Unfortunately, not everyone demonstrated the kind of authentic leadership we are looking for in our winner." Blake stood behind the cameras with clenched fists, watching Marcus orchestrate what amounted to a public execution of someone whose only crime had been treating others with genuine kindness. The editing team had worked overtime to create a narrative where Madeline's helpfulness looked like manipulation, her expertise looked like showing off, and her private conversations with Blake looked like strategic networking. "Madeline," Tom continued, "you have shown impressive knowledge of environmental conservation, but several of your teammates have expressed concerns about fairness and transparency. How do you respond to suggestions that you have had access to information or advantages that others have not?" The question was a trap, wrapped in the language of journalism, and everyone present knew it. Madeline could deny the accusations and look defensive, or acknowledge them and validate suspicions that had no basis in reality. "I have never received information about challenges or eliminations ahead of time," she said clearly. "I have shared everything I know about conservation and survival with anyone who asked, and I have tried to treat everyone here with the same respect I would want to receive." "But you acknowledge having private conversations with members of the production team?" Blake felt his jaw tighten. The question made it sound like she had been plotting strategy in backroom meetings rather than sharing her genuine passion for photography and nature with someone who appreciated both. "I have talked with Blake Jennings about photography and conservation," Madeline replied, meeting the host's eyes steadily. "Those conversations were personal, not strategic, and they had nothing to do with the competition." "How can the rest of us be sure about that?" Tiffany interjected, her voice carrying just the right note of wounded fairness. "How do we know what was discussed during those private meetings?" Rachel Kim had heard enough. "Maybe because Madeline has been transparently honest about everything since the day we arrived. Maybe because she has shared food, knowledge, and assistance with every single person here, including people who are now questioning her integrity." "That could be strategic too," Derek suggested. "Building trust so people would not suspect ulterior motives." The circular logic of suspicion was becoming self-reinforcing, and Blake realized with growing horror that his uncle had engineered a perfect trap. Any evidence of Madeline's genuine character could be reframed as evidence of her strategic manipulation. Her authenticity had become a liability in an environment where everyone expected deception. "Enough," Blake said, stepping forward from his position behind the cameras. Eddie Martinez looked panicked. "Blake, we are in the middle of filming. We are in the middle of character assassination," Blake corrected, his voice carrying the kind of authority that made everyone in the clearing straighten unconsciously. "And it stops now." Marcus stepped forward smoothly. "Nephew, I understand your concern for fair play, but we cannot interrupt the production process for personal feelings." "Personal feelings," Blake repeated, his voice dangerously quiet. "Is that what we are calling basic human decency now?" The cameras were still rolling, capturing every moment of what was becoming either the most dramatic reality television moment of the year or a complete breakdown of the show's format. Blake knew that everything he said next would have consequences far beyond this single evening, but he also knew that some things mattered more than business interests. "Madeline Newman is the most genuinely good person I have met in years," he announced to the assembled group. "She has never asked me for favors, never tried to leverage our friendship for strategic advantage, and never treated this competition as anything other than an opportunity to share her passion for conservation with a wider audience. If that makes her unsuitable for reality television, then the problem is with reality television, not with her." The silence that followed was profound. Contestants stared at Blake with varying degrees of shock, calculation, and understanding. Eddie looked like he was having a heart attack, Marcus looked like he was planning a hostile takeover, and Madeline looked like she was seeing Blake clearly for the first time since learning about his deception. "Furthermore," Blake continued, his voice growing stronger as he committed fully to burning every bridge that connected him to his uncle's version of business success. "This show was supposed to highlight environmental conservation and sustainable living practices. Instead, it has become an exercise in manufactured drama and artificial conflict. That ends tonight." Tom Bradley, the host, looked desperately toward the production team for guidance. Reality television hosts were trained to manage contestant meltdowns, not investor rebellions. Marcus stepped forward with the smooth confidence of someone who had been preparing for this moment since Blake was old enough to inherit family responsibilities. I think emotions are running high tonight. Perhaps we should take a break and resume filming tomorrow when everyone has had time to reflect on their priorities. My priorities are perfectly clear, Blake replied. I am withdrawing my investment from this production, effective immediately. I am also formally protesting the elimination process and demanding that all footage from tonight be reviewed by an independent party before any editing decisions are made. The legal and financial implications of his announcement would take weeks to sort out, but the immediate impact was electric. Contestants began talking simultaneously, some protesting that the game should continue as planned, others agreeing that the process had become unfair, and still others calculating how Blake's withdrawal might affect their own chances of winning. Through the chaos, Blake found Madeline's eyes across the clearing. She was studying him with the same careful attention she gave to wildlife in their natural habitat, trying to understand the complex motivations behind behavior that did not fit established patterns. "Why?" she asked simply, her voice somehow carrying clearly despite the commotion around them. Blake smiled, and for the first time in weeks, the expression felt completely natural. "Because some things are more important than winning. And because you deserve better than this." What happened next would depend on lawyers, network executives, and contract negotiations that neither of them fully understood. But in that moment, surrounded by the chaos of a reality show collapsing under the weight of its own contradictions, Madeline and Blake had found something more valuable than television fame or prize money. They had found each other, and this time they were both being completely honest about who they really were. The game was over, but their story was just beginning. Epilogue. 6 months later, Madeline stood in the renovated greenhouse behind Detroit Urban Wildlife Center, watching Blake attempt to photograph a particularly uncooperative red-tailed hawk that had taken up residence in their rehabilitation program. "I think she knows you're trying too hard," Madeline observed, adjusting the telephoto lens on her own camera with the easy competence of someone who had spent months perfecting her technique under the tutelage of someone with more money than sense and an impressive collection of professional equipment. "Hawks do not have opinions about photography," Blake muttered, but he lowered his camera and stepped back as suggested. Immediately the bird settled into a more natural pose, and Madeline got the shot he had been chasing for 20 minutes. "Everything has opinions about photography," she corrected gently. "You just have to learn how to listen." The Detroit Urban Wildlife Center had been Blake's idea, though he would never admit it in public. After the spectacular implosion of Wild Hearts had made headlines across entertainment and business media, he had found himself with unexpected free time and a growing desire to invest in projects that mattered rather than projects that simply generated profit. "It is not charity," he had told Madeline during one of their morning walks through Belle Isle, which had resumed once the production trucks and artificial drama had disappeared from the park. "It is partnership. You provide the expertise and passion. I provide the funding and business infrastructure. We create something that actually helps urban wildlife instead of just talking about it." The center had opened 3 months ago in a converted warehouse space in Detroit's Eastern Market District, combining rehabilitation facilities for injured urban wildlife with educational programs for school children and adults. Madeline taught weekend workshops on urban gardening and wildlife photography, while Blake discovered he had a talent for grant writing and a surprising amount of patience for the bureaucratic requirements of non-profit management. "Your mother called again," Madeline mentioned as they packed up their equipment for the day. "She wants to know if you are bringing me to the charity gala next weekend." Blake grimaced. His relationship with his family had become significantly more complicated since his very public break with Jennings Industries and his equally public relationship with someone his mother considered unsuitable for the family reputation. His sister Sophia had stopped speaking to him entirely, and Uncle Marcus was currently involved in a protracted legal battle over control of the company. "You do not have to go if you do not want to," he said carefully. "These events can be intense." "Are you embarrassed by me?" Madeline asked, though her tone suggested she was more curious than hurt. "Embarrassed?" Blake looked genuinely shocked. "Madeline, you are the most accomplished person I know. You have a doctorate in biology. You have published research on urban ecosystem management, and you have built a wildlife rehabilitation program from scratch. If anyone should be embarrassed, it is me for showing up with nothing but money and questionable business ethics." "Your business ethics have improved considerably," she pointed out, "and your wildlife photography is getting much better too." They walked through the center together, checking on the various rehabilitation enclosures and making notes for the next day's educational programs. A group of middle school students was scheduled to visit tomorrow, and Madeline was particularly excited about showing them the urban hawk family that had recently taken up residence in one of Detroit's abandoned industrial buildings. "Rachel texted," Madeline said as they locked up the facility. "She wants to know if we are free for dinner Thursday. She has news about the fashion show fundraiser." Rachel Kim had become an unexpected ally in their conservation work, organizing fashion industry events that raised money for urban wildlife programs while showcasing sustainable and locally produced clothing. Her relationship with Madeline's brother Caio had also progressed from casual friendship to something that looked suspiciously like love, though neither of them would admit it publicly. "Does she still think I am a reformed corporate villain who is going to break your heart and steal your life savings?" Blake asked. "She thinks you are a work in progress with good intentions and excellent camera equipment," Madeline corrected, "which is about the best you can hope for from someone whose job involves protecting me from bad decisions." They drove back toward downtown Detroit in Blake's Tesla, though he had recently traded his collection of luxury sports cars for more practical vehicles better suited to transporting wildlife rehabilitation equipment. The penthouse overlooking the Detroit River remained, but it now served as much as a planning space for conservation projects as a private residence. "I have been thinking about the book project," Madeline said as they navigated evening traffic. "The publisher wants to expand it beyond just Detroit urban wildlife. They're interested in a series about conservation efforts in post-industrial cities across the Midwest." "That sounds incredible," Blake replied, though something in his voice suggested concern rather than excitement. "It would mean traveling for research. Cleveland, Pittsburgh, Milwaukee, maybe some smaller cities that are developing innovative approaches to urban sustainability." Madeline glanced at him sideways. "I know that might complicate things between us." Blake was quiet for several minutes, processing the implications of her expanding career and the reality that their relationship was still relatively new, built on a foundation of shared interests, but not yet tested by the kind of practical challenges that separated temporary connections from lasting partnerships. "You should absolutely do it," he said finally. "This is exactly the kind of work you have always wanted to do. And if it means spending time apart while you research, then we figure out how to make that work." "You could come with me," Madeline suggested carefully, "if you wanted to. The wildlife photography angle would add visual interest to the book, and you seem to enjoy the fieldwork more than boardroom meetings anyway." Blake felt something shift in his chest, a sensation he was still learning to recognize, as hope mixed with the kind of contentment that had nothing to do with financial success or social status. "You would want me to come with you." "I would want you to come with me," she confirmed. "Assuming you can handle sleeping in actual tents and eating food that does not come from five-star restaurants." "I think I can manage," Blake replied, and meant it. 6 months ago, the idea of abandoning his business responsibilities for weeks of travel focused on conservation research would have seemed like professional suicide. Now it sounded like the best possible way to spend his time. They pulled into the parking garage beneath Blake's building, but neither made any immediate move to get out of the car. The evening light was reflecting off the Detroit River in shades of gold and copper that reminded Madeline of their first morning together in Belle Isle Park, when she had thought Blake was just another photography enthusiast, and he had thought she was just another reality show contestant. "Do you ever wonder what would have happened if we had met differently?" she asked. "Without all the drama and deception and manufactured conflict?" Blake considered the question seriously. "I think we would have found each other eventually. Maybe not as quickly, and definitely not as dramatically, but I think we would have found each other." "What makes you so sure?" "Because," Blake said, reaching over to take her hand, "you see the world the way I want to learn to see it. And apparently, I see you the way you want to be seen. That kind of compatibility does not happen by accident." Madeline smiled, the expression lighting up her entire face in the way that still made Blake feel like he was discovering something miraculous every time it happened. "That is probably the most romantic thing anyone has ever said to me." "I have been practicing," he admitted. "Rachel gave me a list of books about healthy relationships and effective communication. Apparently, my previous approach to personal connections needed significant improvement." "Your previous approach to personal connections was basically non-existent," Madeline pointed out. "Any improvement is significant improvement." They rode the elevator up to Blake's penthouse, comfortable in the kind of easy silence that develops between people who have moved past the need to fill every moment with conversation. The space had changed significantly since Madeline had started spending time there. Plants filled the windows, wildlife photography covered the walls, and the sterile perfection of expensive interior design had given way to the comfortable disorder of people who actually lived there. "Your grandmother called too," Blake mentioned, as they settled onto the couch with takeout from their favorite Vietnamese restaurant. "She wants to know if I am planning to make an honest woman of you, or if she needs to have a conversation with me about my intentions." Madeline nearly choked on her spring roll. "She did not actually say that." "She did. I like her directness. It is refreshing after years of dealing with people who never say what they actually mean." "And what did you tell her?" Blake set down his chopsticks and turned to face her fully. "I told her that my intentions were entirely honorable, but that any major life decisions would be made together when we were both ready and without pressure from well-meaning family members who think 6 months is plenty of time to know whether two people should spend the rest of their lives together." "Very diplomatic," Madeline observed, though knowing my grandmother, she probably appreciated the honesty more than the diplomacy. "She invited me to Sunday dinner next week. Apparently, she wants to teach me how to make her famous lasagna, which she says is essential knowledge for anyone planning to be part of the family long-term." Madeline felt warmth spread through her chest, the kind of happiness that came from watching two of her favorite people decide they liked each other. "She only teaches the lasagna recipe to people she thinks are permanent fixtures. It is a very exclusive honor." "I will try to be worthy of it," Blake replied solemnly, though his eyes were sparkling with amusement. They spent the rest of the evening planning the next day's educational programs, reviewing grant applications for expanding the Wildlife Center, and discussing the logistics of their upcoming research trip. It was the kind of ordinary domestic evening that Blake had never imagined wanting, and that Madeline had never dared hope she could have with someone who understood both her professional passions and her personal dreams. Outside the floor-to-ceiling windows, Detroit's skyline glittered with the lights of commerce and industry. But inside the penthouse, two people who had found each other through manufactured drama and artificial conflict were building something genuine, sustainable, and entirely their own. The reality show had ended in spectacular fashion, but their reality was just beginning, and it promised to be far more interesting than anything television could have manufactured.